Good evening. This is unbelievably impressive. I'm in awe. I'm in awe in two ways. First of all, of having this very, very special attendance here. And number two, obviously, about the buildings up here and the facilities we have. Somebody here just made a comment and said, if something would happen to this room, we would be in deep trouble with critical theory of photography in the world. So thank you all for coming. I'm Arthur Walther, and I'm very delighted to welcome you to this two-day symposium, Imagining Everyday Life, which we have co-organized with the Center for the Study of Social Difference at Columbia University here, and with the Barnard Center for Research on Women at Barnard College. We are hosted here by the Lenfest Center for the Arts, this brand new complex of the art school. And we have had over the last several weeks an unbelievable coordination on collaboration with them. There are a number of thanks to be given, and I want to thank first the three key visionary organizers of this event, and I will introduce them in depth in a few moments. Number one, Mariana Hirsch, Tina Kempt, and Brian Wallis. They have assembled a powerhouse of speakers and panels for the next 2 days. I'm deeply grateful for the special roster of speakers from a wide variety of fields and perspectives, some of whom who have traveled extremely extensively, and I'm just thinking about Geoffrey Batchen, who came from New Zealand, and I think you didn't come from South Africa, but somewhere in the Midwest, right? Okay, good. But so we are bringing here together scholars, curators, writers from all aspects. I would also like to thank, there are a number of institutions and departments here at Columbia which have been extremely helpful in supporting this exhibition, and I want to mention them, and I'll just read them down. The Society of Fellows and the Hyman Center for Humanities, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, the Institute for African Studies, and the Department of Art History and Archaeology. There are two more who have given generous support. The Andrew and Marina Loon Family Foundation, as well as Alan Governor at Documenta Arts. Both of them are here, and thank you both for supporting this. Last not least, I want to thank very much Katerina Lasota, the Associate Director of the Center here, and Sarah Softness, the Director of Exhibition and Collection at the Volta Collection, and Felix, Jan, who have organized this over the last several weeks. Briefly, a few words about the Volta Collection. We are a non-profit organization, and we have been deeply involved in researching, collecting, exhibiting, and publishing about photography and media art. The collection has a campus in southern Germany of 4 buildings with 9 exhibition galleries and about 10,000 square feet of exhibition space. And we have a project space here in New York. Over the last 8 years, we are known very much with regards to our activities in African and in Asian areas. Over the last 8 years, we have done 14 exhibitions strictly on African photography and media art here in New York, and we have done 3 on Asian. We have done 4 large-scale exhibitions at our project, at our space in Germany on African art. So that has been our major focus. But a few years ago, we began looking at vernacular photography, both historical and contemporary. This has been, over the last several years, our focus with regards to research, with regards to collecting, and with regards to exhibiting. To show you how serious we approach this effort, there is going to be a series of 5 exhibitions here in New York, a major exhibition then in Germany, a major publication with Steidl on the subject of vernacular photography. We have currently 1 exhibition at our space in Chelsea, and you are all very much invited, if you have the time and the interest afterwards, to come by. The space will be open until 9:30 this evening. The focus we have had here in New York and continuing in Germany has been chaired and organized and run by Brian, whom you will hear much more later on. So today's symposium from our side is very much an integral part of this overall effort. We would like to use some of these contributions here, these discussions, these presentations, and then incorporate them into a major publication, which Brian is going to edit, which will happen next year. With regards to the next 2 days, we are having 4 panels. There is a panel starting immediately afterwards. This evening panel is starting out with a very basic question: why vernacular photography, the limits and possibilities of the field? And it tries to look at vernacular photography and kind of tries to define and pinpoint aspects of it. And it too will investigate what vernacular photography can give us insights into how we conceptualize family narratives, personal identities, the political community, and social environment. Tomorrow at 10:30, the topic is troubling portraiture, photographic portraits in the shadow archive. It deals with identification photographs, and it looks very much like into the past, where photography has been used to categorize, to sort, to segregate, based on occupation, based on the social group, based on the body type, or political affiliation. This panel is chaired by Tina Kempt. In the afternoon, the topic is performance and transformation, photographic revisions of subjectivity, and it looks basically at representations and the self-imaging with regards to race, gender, and sexuality, and this panel is chaired by Jill Hochberg. Last panel tomorrow afternoon at 4:30, Space, Materiality, and the Social Words of the Photograph, which examines the physical nature of vernacular photographs, as well as their relationship to viewing conventions and circulation, and that is chaired by Mariana Hirsch. Without further, I like to introduce the 3 main organizers, and I will do this very briefly. Mariana Hirsch has been working on vernacular photography for the last 25 years, and she has been looking specifically at what everyday images do as a media of memory, and how they appear in literary works, memoirs, in the work of artists who frame and comment on them. She has written extensively several books, The Family Frames, Photography, Narrative, and Post-Memory, The Familial Gaze. She wrote about both family photos and street photos in 2 books, The Generation of Post-Memory and Ghosts of Home. Her forthcoming book, School Photos in Liquid Time, is on class pictures. She is the director of Columbia University's Center for the Study of Social Difference and teaches comparative literature and gender studies at Columbia. Tina Kempt is professor of Africana and Women Studies at Barnard College and former director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. In this academic year, she is on a sabbatical, or she's a fellow at the Columbia Institute in Paris. And I haven't seen her yet, so I hope she is making it. It is great to have her back. So Tina's research on vernacular photography goes back quite a while too, and she looks at how these images move and affect us, and in particular how it allows Black communities in diaspora to say something about themselves. And she argues that the effect these images have on us are not only through sight, but through other sensory registers. Her last 2 books were Listening to Images and Image Matters. And now I would like to introduce Brian. Brian, I have worked with Brian and known Brian over the last 2 decades in all various capacities and iterations. Brian is the curator at the collection who leads our research and exhibition efforts with regards to this project. He was chief curator at the International Center of Photography from 2000 to 2015 and did numerous exhibitions there. Amongst them, evidence, Iraqi prison photographs from Abu Ghraib. I actually do remember this exhibition very much. Miroslav Tichy, and African-American vernacular photography selections from a Daniel Cohen collection. Brian is interested in the social uses of photography and how photograph shapes identity, in particular with regards to attitude styles, race, gender, sexuality, nation, and belonging. I do want to mention one other person before we get going, and that is Okwi Envesor, who has been a big supporter of the collection and has been deeply involved over the years. He is battling, as we all know, cancer, and he got caught in this political drama in Germany and in this dynamics in southern, in Munich. There was recently, 2 days ago, an article in the New York Times, and I just want to quote him, which was the end of that article. Museums, and I quote, "Museums are places for the human imagination. And that means we want to be as open as possible in our engagement with that imagination." And he added, "I'm proud to have been part of that conversation." And I think our objective these next 2 days is kind of to tie a little bit into that concept. And with this, I think I give it over to Brian and the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. That was a very nice sentiment. Okwi is very much in our thoughts, all of us. I would also like to thank my co-organizers for this conference, and thank you for your wonderful attendance. My co-organizers, Mariana Hirsch and Tina Kempt. I couldn't have done it without them, and I really appreciate all of the great presenters who have taken time to come here and participate in this conference. The title of this panel, this first panel, as you can see, is Why Vernacular Photography, the Limits and Possibilities of a Field. But this panel is just one part of a conference, which is part of a year-long project titled Imagining Everyday Life, organized by the Volta Collection, focusing on the history and uses of vernacular photography. One goal is to try to define the field of vernacular photography by presenting representative examples, delineating general characteristics, establishing conceptual categories, and proposing various modes for further critical inquiry. Through exhibitions, publications, and public discussions such as this one, this project encourages an expansive definition of vernacular photography and embraces new technologies and interpretive approaches. Today's panel considers the fundamental question: why vernacular photography? What forms are described by this category? Is the term meaningful, adequate, even necessary? How might the critical methodologies and interpretive tools used to describe vernacular photography differ from those applied to other forms of visual culture? And how might a clearer notion of vernacular photography frame our understanding of our own identities, our own social interactions and affiliations, our own futures? Here's a typical vernacular photograph with an atypical subject. It is an American tintype from about 1875 of a photographer at work. This is where most histories of photography begin, with the photographer, the generator of images, the source of style. But here the photographer is himself the subject. He is shown as a worker, stripped to his shirt sleeves, with his camera, his instrument of work, but also his professional attribute, holding a bell, as you can see, as if waiting for the next customer in his workplace. The format and medium are appropriate to his status. Tintypes were ordinary, durable, rapidly produced, and inexpensive. These qualities fostered a new freedom in late 19th century photography in which the sitters played a significant role in establishing their self-expression and cultural identity in the photography studio. Allowing for typical poses and backdrops, customers were suddenly free to present themselves with pride or humor in clothes and props of their own choosing to assert their social status. Vernacular photographs often foreground the relative class status of their subjects, makers, and viewers. Proletarian occupational tintypes, such as these, were common in the 19th century and often show workers demonstrating their identity by displaying the tools of their trade or the products of their labor. These worker photographs defy the bourgeois definition of the portrait as an honorific presentation or a window on the soul. Instead, they are more like fragments of a largely invisible social archive, what theorist and photographer Alan Sekula called the shadow archive. With this phrase, Sekula referred to an entire social field of human representation, comprising both heroes and deviants, within which every portrait takes its place as part of a social and moral hierarchy, an imaginary ranking and organizing of information and identity. In other words, the meanings and social uses of individual vernacular photographs, even personal family photographs, depend on viewing and understanding them not singly, but relatively, in the context of their arrangement and positioning within social groups, communities, cultures, sets, and series. Take another grid of ordinary photographs. These photo booth pictures affixed to a scrapbook page constitute a different kind of social group, a rural community of friends, informally united in casual poses and country fashions. In considering language or architecture, the term vernacular generally refers to the commonplace, the unschooled, the regional, or the colloquial form, as opposed to the polished, high style, the elite, the professional. Geoffrey Batchen was perhaps the first to recognize the problem that vernacular photography posed for photography in general, calling it in 2001 a troublesome field. These abject photographies, he said, challenged the art historical formalist precepts of the history of photography, not only because of their sheer ubiquity and variety, but worse, because of their often dull or repetitive visual qualities. In the past 20 years or so, the term vernacular photography has been used to designate a very broad class of photographic approaches that include studio portrait photography, stereographs, tintypes, photo booth pictures, snapshots, photo albums, documentary or evidence photographs, often made for legal, ethnographic, medical, or commercial archives. But what unites these images is not their low aesthetic status, whether made by untrained makers or professional photographers, but their origin in utilitarian motives and social uses. They are tailored to specific avenues of circulation and governed by conventional notions of truth and realism. In a recent study of the work of Walker Evans, Clement Cheroux drew attention to the influential views of the mid-20th century writer John Couvenhoven concerning vernacular culture. In books like Made in America, The Arts in Modern Civilization, 1948, Couvenhoven argued that vernacular culture is shaped by that which is useful, domestic, and popular. The use of vernacular photographs, for example, is often imposed through identification photos at sites of employment or government regulation, as in photos for driver's licenses, identity cards, or passbooks. During World War II, for example, many American corporations created special photographic identification badges for their workers, such as these, especially where issues of security and surveillance were involved. These metal pinback identity badges happen to all come from the Long Island-based G&G Precision Works, a World War II military subcontractor noted for small appliances, electrical signs, and mechanical tools. With such identification photographs, the character or personality of the sitter, the hallmark of the conventional portrait, was suddenly irrelevant. Such conventionalized portraits lack meaning individually and assume relevance only, again, in relation to one another, in a series, as part of a domestic community, in this case, the industrialized workforce. Again, as Couvenhoven argues, in contrast with elitist forms, the vernacular is unabashedly popular. It celebrates the exaggerated and the outlandish, the crude and the camp. Here, a good example is this protracted series of Polaroid photographs known as Type 42, after the black and white Polaroid film stock used to make them. In this series, an obsessive TV viewer recorded the appearance of no less than 900 female movie stars from the late 1960s as they appeared in low-budget and sci-fi movies. Most of the photographs are carefully inscribed with the name of the actress and sometimes the name of the film, sometimes even bodily measurements. This gender-driven inventory of female roles spans the period's repertoire of popular culture with well-known actresses such as Kim Basinger, Dionne Warwick, Ava Gardner, Mia Farrow, and I think you can see Elizabeth Taylor, alongside forgotten and cult figures. This series is not only a testament to personal taste and obsessive desire, but also a catalog of social attitudes regarding beauty, sexuality, femininity, and visual pleasure. Ariella Azoulay has demonstrated how the deployment of photography can be used by the stateless or powerless to assert agency or advance citizenship. One interesting example of this type of self-defined political and psychological positioning is the collage scrapbook and photo album arranged over several years by a veteran named Richard Hicks Bowman. Bowman served in the U.S. Air Force during World War II and was stationed in what is today Western New Guinea. Compiled in the 1950s from artifacts that span over a decade, the album chronicles Bowman's war service, his discharge, and his post-war life in New Orleans. This personal archive combines photographs with various printed ephemera, often collaged together with postage stamps. Words or phrases are often clipped from magazines and newspapers as captions to comment on pictures of himself, war buddies, or old girlfriends. But most of the commentary concerns Bowman's experiences as an African-American serviceman. News clippings refer to the number and treatment of African Americans in the service, and some highlight mistreatment. Bowman celebrates the USO visit of boxer Joe Louis and refers to dark-skinned Pacific Islanders as, quote, my people and my brothers. Such albums are creative spaces in which consumers of popular culture can reappropriate vernacular imagery and translate it into relevant personal political expressions. Patricia Hayes has written eloquently about the work of contemporary South African artist Santu Mofokeng. In a work titled The Black Photo Album, which you see here, Mofokeng interrogates the history of late 19th and early 20th century African studio portraiture from a post-colonial perspective. From 1988 to 1998, Mofokeng worked as a photographer and researcher at the Institute for Advanced Social Research at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Throughout this time, he acquired, compiled, and retouched an expansive archive of studio portraits featuring middle-class black sitters from 1890 to 1950, from which he created an extensive slideshow. It features reproductions of the vintage prints that the artist digitized and restored, and incorporates text slides that identify the sitters, cite speeches that present racist ideologies, or pose provocative questions crafted by Mofokeng himself. For example, in one slide, Mofokeng asks, are these images evidence of mental colonization, or did they serve to challenge prevailing images of the African in the Western world? Another, as you see here, says, who were these people? What were their aspirations? With the Black Photo Album, the artist uses an interrogative method to expose the neglected history of urban black working class individuals, to consider the status of middle-class Africans of the early 20th century, and to offer a new consideration of their complex identities and aspirations. The critical approach to vernacular photography I'm outlining here is rooted in an understanding of everyday life, acknowledging the value of the banal and the overlooked, the boring and the passive, the repetitive non-events as seen through commonplace photography. French theorist Henri Lefebvre defined everyday life as, quote, in a sense residual, defined by what is left over after all distinct, superior, specialized, structured activities have been singled out by analysis. Everyday life defines itself as a totality. In other words, everyday life is the common ground through which individuals negotiate the essentially political decisions that govern their daily lives, their self-representations, and their resistance or conformity to political regulations and social mores. This project equates the commonality of everyday life as described by Lefebvre to the ubiquitous production and distribution of vernacular photography. and views photography not as a neutral recording device, but as a mediating construction and an aspirational vision of the future, an imagined version of the present that a future viewer will one day encounter. Thank you. And now I'd like you to join me in welcoming Ariella Azoulay.
Thank you. Let me start by thanking you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to hear all my colleagues today and tomorrow. My colleagues or those whom I read. The invitation was double, to reflect on what is vernacular photography and to look at the collection. So I couldn't do both in 15 minutes, and I chose the second. I looked at the catalog, the book that was published of African photography, and this is what I'm going to present today. I just want to make sure that I know how. Oh, yep. Okay. It is no secret that millions of objects never destined for museal display have been looted from all over the world by different imperial agents. It is no secret that many of them have been carefully handled, preserved, and displayed to this day in Western museums as precious art objects. At the same time, it is no secret that millions of people, stripped bare of most of their material world, including tools, ornaments, and other artifacts, continue to seek a place where they can be at home again and rebuild a habitable world. These two seemingly unrelated movements of forced migration of people and artifacts, as well as their separation, are as old as the invention of the New World. Here are some looted Zulu artifacts that need to be shown in connection with some of the photographs that I will discuss. Here you see some images from the British Museum that holds these artifacts. Sorry. People and artifacts have become objects of observation and study, conservation and care, command and control by two seemingly unrelated sets of disciplines, institutions, and their scholars and experts. In truth, however, the two movements of forced migration are not unrelated. With a certain endlessly recurring brevity, similar to that of the operation of a camera shutter, the unending instantiation of their separation, people and objects, is reiterated. They are continuously produced as disconnected, as if it were the nature of artifacts to exist outside of their communities, as you saw them a minute earlier in these objects. So they are continuously produced as disconnected, as if it were the nature of artifacts to exist outside of their communities, to come into being as museum objects, to be out of reach of those who felt at home in their midst, as if it were the nature of certain people to exist bereft of the worldly objects of which there are inherited knowledge and rights, protective social fabric and safety, bliss and happiness, sorrow and death are inscribed, as if these objects were not a source of worldliness and a fountain of liveliness for the communities from which they were taken. And we're speaking about mass looted objects that are related to Zulu objects or some other photographs that I'm going to look at from South Africa. Look at this person and think of the camera shutter. Let us listen, this time not to the image with Tina Kempt, but rather to the shutter's click. It is a commonplace in the discourse of photography that an operating shutter is necessary for obtaining a legible, sharp, and precise image out of the flow of light. understood as a subservient element of the photographic apparatus. The shutter, a means to an end. The shutter is discussed mainly in technical terms related to the rapidity of its closure, the ability to control and change its velocity, and the swiftness of its performance. The picture to be obtained is presumed to exist, even for a brief moment, as a petit sovereign. The petit sovereign is not what is recorded in the photograph in terms of its final content or image, but rather the standalone photograph to be, the image that prefigures and conditions the closing and opening of a shutter. The petit sovereign asserts itself at the moment as preceding and separate from the photographic event and from the situation out of which a photograph is about to be extracted. It commands what sort of things have to be distant, bracketed, removed, forgotten, suppressed, ignored, overcome, and made irrelevant for the shutter of the camera to function, as well as for a photograph to be taken and its meaning accepted. What is suppressed and made irrelevant is excised by the shutter. In the technological and historical discussion of the shutter, the only elements that matters are the quality, precision, clarity, recognizability of the images, the end product, and the erasure of any trace of the shutter's operation, the shutter that splits worlds. This is an effect of the means-end relationship between the camera and the images it produces. It also reflects the dissociation of the camera's shutter from other imperial shutters. The shutter is a synecdoche for the operation of the entire imperial enterprises on which the invention of photography was modeled. If the shutter is an imperial apparatus, photography itself also should be understood within the context of European imperialism. In a radical way, imagine that the origins of photography were not to be found somewhere around the beginning of the 19th century, but go back to 1492. What could this mean? To answer this question, we have to unlearn experts' knowledge that calls upon us to account for photography as having its own origins, its histories, its practices, and futures, and explore photography and explore it as part of the imperial world in which it emerged. Let me say it bluntly, this photograph could not have been taken outside the context of an imperial power, which against local resistance decided to open up, with quotation marks, Zululand, and wage a war against the Zulu kingdom. Such war was deemed both justified and unavoidable, for, to quote Jan Knight, Zululand was an anachronism, and I'm quoting, a symbol of an alien and incomprehensible way of life, which must inevitably give way in the face of European-driven concepts of progress, unquote. So we cannot look at this photograph without considering the military expedition, the military invasions, and what these invasions include. Confronting the Zulu kingdom, the British were already equipped with a host of imperial shutters. And here you can see that when I'm speaking about imperial shutter, I'm not speaking about this mechanical device that we associate with photography. I'm speaking about this power, this violence to split worlds, to separate people from objects, and to define who are they. Confronting the Zulu kingdom, the British forces were already equipped with a host of imperial shutters that had already been in place, capable of dividing people against each other. And here you can see an image of forced collaboration, forcing or incentivizing them in lack of other choices to collaborate against their people, and oftentimes against their own interests, partitioning their land. This is another imperial shutter, fragmenting the worldliness of which they had been part, Following their invasion to the Zululand, the British divided Zulu Empire into 13 kinglets so as to make sure that at least some of those would fight against each other. Disempowered, their power could be exploited for the growing photographic industry of exotic types, whose authenticity is enhanced or undermined with and through museum collections. And, sorry, no, let's wait with this. And of course, some of the shields that you see here are in the British Museum. Anachronism is one among several common imperial excuses for the destruction of entire worlds in which worldly principles could impede and oppose the relentless expansion of racial exploitation of people and their reduction to labor power that can be exploited and traded. Defeating the Zulu, one of the most powerful and independent African groups south to the Zambezi, was essential in order to make Zululand penetrable for further white settlements, market forces, and commercial exploitation. Photography operated within the logic of racial capitalism, and its expanding markets offered a primary accumulation of visual wealth. This form of accumulation could not have been flourished without the transformation of people into raw material and the extraction of free labor from the photographed person. With very low investment, a camera, some recycled accessories, and an improvised screen posed indoor, as you can see in this photograph of the photographer's studio, or outdoor, as you can see in this photograph, photographers could start making their name and glory, sometimes their fortune, often enriching bigger sharks and always taking part in the feast of racial and colonial accumulation on the ruins of yet another culture that had been opened up. And these images are images from which I removed the photographed person in order to look at the photographer's studio. Unlearning photography as a field apart means, first and foremost, foregrounding the regime of imperial rights that made its emergence possible. I won't have time to expand on the formation of imperial rights. Instead, I would mention briefly some of them, those that come into play when we are interpolated to smoothly inhabit the positions in which such rights are inscribed, the position of photographers, collectors, scholars, and spectators alike. When photography emerged, the right to dissect worlds was already taken for granted. The right is exercised with each and every click of any of the imperial shutters operated by the military, by museums, or in the academia. With every click, the fragmentation, categorization, expropriation, and accumulation of shards of people's shattered worlds is facilitated, enabled, naturalized, and reaffirmed. Let me repeat, imperial shutters dissociate people from their objects, thus opening up their worlds for brutal interventions. When plundered objects, such as this shield or headgears, as captured here, find their way into museum as precious objects under the care of privileged experts, the people among whom they were once meaningful could be treated as raw material, as you would see in a minute in several photographs that I will show. The skills of the photographed for whom these objects were once meaningful are reduced to their usable strengths and exploitable labor power. Thus, for example, in one of the commercial variations of this image, the once threatening strengths of the Zulu warrior is repurposed for a new occupation, the rickshaw puller, described as capable of going at a great pace for long distances, frequently from 30 to 40 miles a day, arriving at his destination, apparently, as when he started. Many images like this one and the following ones were studied as instantiations of epistemological violence and were described as racist misconceptions, a timeless image of people beyond history, or another quote, imagery that essentializes men, women, and children as representations of such and such tribe, unquote. This important critique is insufficient. The camera shutter did not initiate a new worldview or open up worlds. It was built upon and benefited from imperial looting, divisions, and rights that were operative in the colonization of the world in which photography was assigned the role of documenting, recording, or contemplating what is already there. Hence, without underestimating the initiatives of photographers in terms of staging, styling, and manipulating the visual rendering of the images, and certainly without excusing the epistemological violence of such images, which many studied in relation to these images, a different kind of violence should be acknowledged. Listening to the violence of imperial shutters that literally shutter worlds, the violence that reduced these children to their abled bodies cannot be said to be epistemological. It is rather an ontological violence. Bear with me a few more minutes. Why is this boy performing to the camera his capacity to sit squatted for a long time? Why is this boy seen carrying these two buckets? It is not, and I'm quoting another reading of this photograph, it is not of the previous photograph of the seated boy. It is not as if to explain this costume as that of a deracinated immigrant whose posture still recalls the culture and customs of his tribes, unquote. This boy is not an immigrant. Most probably he is one of those children kidnapped into apprenticeship? Yeah, I hope so. Apprenticeship, okay, was one of the several euphemisms given in South Africa at the time to the kidnapping, forced migration, and enslavement of children. Numerous children were enslaved in this way. Sitting like that is not about lost vernacular costume. This, as well as the image of the young boy who is captured barefooted, carrying two heavy buckets, are emblems of miners. This is a performance of an advertisement for exactly those skills which were shortage in Kimberley at the time of the Diamonds Rush. The photographers of these images seem to refrain from acknowledging that these boys were photographing were made orphans and enslaved. Slavery was abolished in South Africa in 1832, but then it was renewed legally as indentured labor. In this context, nothing impeded those photographers from advertising the bodily qualities of the photographed children and recording their endurance. Color pale yellow, rather pleasant during early youth, but sickly in appearance in persons of 30, unquote. Your photographs should be mined farther. It is wrong, your or ours. It is wrong to stop after excavating of the first layers of epistemological violence. One should dig farther to sort out the role those photographers played in catering for the shortage, not only in images, but also in free labor. If and when reprinted, these images of enslaved miners should be reframed properly. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and thanks to all those who actually made it possible for me to physically be here. Let's see. looks like it. This symposium has been called to, and I quote, articulate the multiple definitions of vernacular photography. It therefore returns us to a problem of definition that was already there at the beginning. Exactly where that beginning is to be marked on a timeline is a matter of debate. However, there is no doubt that, like most terms, vernacular photography has a history. It hasn't always just been. I want to suggest that a tracing of that history might allow us to address what is at stake in the use of such a combination of words, and what questions can and should be asked about that use today. I first used the term, although in a pluralized form, in about 2000, most notably in an essay I wrote to accompany an issue of History of Photography that I guest edited on the same theme. However, my essay was preceded by a commercial exposition in New York in October of 1998, billed as the first Vernacular Photography Fair. Organised by dealer Stephen Cohen, the fair's prospectus argued that the most exciting development in the area of photo collecting has been in vernacular photography. It was the first time I had seen snapshots and tintypes presented in mats and on offer for what I considered to be considerable sums of money. Even more remarkable, at least for me, was the ensemble of speakers who had been invited to discuss the definition of vernacular photography on a panel on opening night. Dale Kaplan, who I think is here tonight, Bill Hunt, Doug Nickel, and myself were all on that panel, representing dealers, collectors, curators, and academia, and thus offering a rare conversation between all these different but overlapping parts of the photography world. Peter Galassi had declined to speak on the panel but was in the audience, along with Stanley Burns and a number of other similarly influential figures. It was clear that something was up. My essay in History of Photography became an attempt to explain what that something was. I began by investigating the use of the word vernacular, a word already employed in architectural circles to describe ordinary structures like homemade mud brick dwellings, but also, and more controversially, like the ugly generic buildings used by Pizza Hut or McDonald's. Someone pointed out to me that John Kuenhoven had published an essay in the Atlantic Monthly in August of 1941, in which he attempted to distinguish vernacular from folk art, an effort he repeated several times in later books. Most importantly, he argued, and I quote, that a direct sensory awareness of vernacular objects provides an important kind of knowledge about American culture. Be that as it may, I decided to define the term vernacular for myself, to rebrand it for the kind of photo discourse that I was then interested in pursuing. I began by associating it with what I called ordinary photographs, those photographs that the established histories of photography had chosen to ignore. I especially emphasized hybrid objects like this one, suggesting that they involved commerce, sentiment, conformity, and touch, all qualities considered not proper to respectable photographs, or at least to respectable historians of photography. But I also referred to neglected indigenous genres and practices, specifically mentioning gilt Indian albumen prints, American painted and framed tintypes, Nigerian Ibiji images, and Mexican photo escultura, like this one. In extending the term in this way, I was encompassing the full range of meanings of the word vernacular in the Oxford English Dictionary, which included ordinary and ubiquitous, but also local, as in the expression speaking in the vernacular. These kinds of regionally specific artifacts, I said, necessarily speak to us of difference, of cultural difference, but also of photography's own differences from itself. Notably, I used the word abject to describe all these photographies, whether ordinary or regional, calling on the work of Julia Kristeva to associate them with what she said disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect borders, positions, rules, the in-between, the ambiguous, the composite. It was in this quasi-revolutionary spirit that I then proceeded, arguing not just for the inclusion, have I got one too far? There we go, that's what it should be. It was in this quasi-revolutionary spirit that I then proceeded, arguing not just for the inclusion of vernacular photographs within the existing history of photography, but for vernaculars to be made, and I quote myself, the organizing principle of photography's history in general, for a vernacular theory of photography to be advanced. In summary, I claim that vernacular photographies demand the invention of suitably vernacular histories. I was aware, of course, that the Museum of Modern Art had mounted an exhibition of 350 snapshots in 1944, claiming them to be an important American folk art, and that John Sikowski had included one snapshot, borrowed for the occasion from a private collection, I hasten to say, to represent all of them in his valedictory 1989 exhibition, Photography Until Now. In other words, I knew already that there was nothing particularly radical or disturbing to the status quo in simply adding vernacular examples to the pantheon of photography. What had to be disturbed was the whole system that supported any such pantheon. What was needed, as I argued in the last line of my essay, was an eruption that promises to transform not just this history's object of study, but its very mode of existence. How then to engineer such an eruption? What would it look like, sound like, be like? In my essay, I rejected traditional art history as having nothing much of use that could be made to illuminate vernacular photographs beyond its close attention to the look of things. I also had various rude things to say about material culture, even though I did suggest borrowing some of its notions. For example, I lauded the idea that photographs might be multi-sensory physical artifacts animated by a social dimension, and thus by a dynamic web of exchanges and functions. On that basis, my essay insisted on the vernacularity of the art photograph, on its specificity to a particular function and regional culture and social class, and so on. Channeling the Roland Barthes of Camera Lucida, I talked about vernaculars as a photography that insists on the cultural density of photographic meaning and assumes the active involvement of the viewer as an interpretive agent. I was no doubt seeking to ally a vernacular history of photography with the ambitions of visual culture and with its desire to speak to, and not just of, its chosen objects of study. The writerly, intensely personal texts of Carol Maver were already demonstrating such a way of talking to and with photographs. Subsequent studies, such as those undertaken by Tina Kempt, have extended the practice to include not only a first-person voice, but also a listening to, calibrated for previously overlooked images, using all the senses at our disposal. When given the opportunity, I have sought to manifest some of my own methodological recommendations in exhibition form. I have, for example, organized these exhibitions around genres, morphologies, and practices, rather than categories like author or innovation. And I've played in creative ways with chronology, typology, and theme. And so such exhibitions have come to focus on memory and forgetting, or on death, or more accurately, on the capacity of certain photographic practices to suspend us between life and death, and to include a range of examples from across photography's history, and to put Western and non-Western photographic objects into uneasy conversation. What's interesting about such exhibitions is that visitors don't feel intimidated by the objects on display. Here are two people in Reykjavik in Iceland looking at that memory box that I showed you a moment ago. They understand these objects and feel sufficiently expert to assess their qualities and shortcomings for themselves, even to become actively involved with them. Two of the venues for Forget-Me-Not invited local people to submit their own photo memory objects, and these were then added to the exhibition, a form of vernacular curating that ensured there was a local accent included in an otherwise international photographic discourse. These exhibitions have also always included photographs made by artists along with all the rest. An albumin print by Julia Margaret Cameron appeared in Forget-Me-Not, and in Suspending Time, prints by Dido Moriyama and Lee Friedlander sat on either side of 100 snapshots that included the photographer's shadow. Here you see me gesturing to the Moriyama print, and you'll notice that my generous Japanese hosts are trying very hard to ignore the fact that I really don't know what I was talking about. Nevertheless, such editions remained a minority, so that the logic of vernacularity continues to dominate the display. In my exhibitions, the demand of the mode of display itself is that the works by artists speak to the concerns of everyday life, rather than the other way around. Unfortunately, working with museums involves compromises. Museums like order and cleanliness and insurability, and they like any snapshots that I want to include to be in mats and frames. Ironically then, my installation repeated the value-added aesthetic model that had so surprised me at that first commercial vernacular photo fair. And in the process, it transformed my humble snapshots into something rather less humble, into something more closely resembling art. After all, the vernacularity of a photograph is not to be found in what it is, but in what it does and where it does it. A snapshot in a frame in an art gallery functions like an artwork, not like a snapshot. Gone, in this installation, were the intimate tactile oral interactions these snapshots once enjoyed with their owners. Gone too was the sense of excess and chaos and serendipity that was once a distinctive part of their character as snapshots. Even 100 of them can't quite conjure the infinity of examples from which they had been arbitrarily selected. Here, they no longer did what they used to do. Oddly enough, in my experience, artists have been more successful in finding a mode of display in which some of these qualities continue to be evident, even in the midst of an art gallery. Here's just one room of many from a current exhibition in my own hometown of Wellington in New Zealand, organised from his own collection of snapshots by Patrick Pound, a New Zealand-born artist now resident in Australia. That's Patrick in the front there. Patrick contributes a local Antipodean accent to a practice now found all around the world, a practice in which contemporary artists work with found vernacular photographs. Pound invents absurd taxonomic categories. This one's called the Gallery of Air, within which to make nonsense of the sheer scale of amateur photography. Among many other effects, the creative absurdity of these categories highlights the equally absurd limits that historians have previously placed on the way photographs are to be valued and regarded. Here's a detail in every photograph included in the work. One finds air somehow made visible. Against these limits, Pound invites everyone to become their own curator and their own historian. He proposes, in other words, the adoption of a writerly, I of course want to call it a vernacular, mode of historical practice. The vernacular turn in this practice, the turn that was initiated perhaps in the early 21st century, has of course now become typical rather than exceptional. The fact that the Volta Collection comprises both portraits by Richard Avedon and criminal mugshots, both works by the Beckers and by Malik Sidibe, and regularly exhibits them in the same exhibition, suggests that any clear distinctions between commercial, artistic, and vernacular photography have long since dissolved. I worry about the ease of that dissolution. The art world has always had a rapacious capacity to absorb the ready-made into its economy, especially if that ready-made can be subsumed to the mesmeric taxonomic pleasures of the grid. Mr. Walter's own collecting was inspired by his interest in the work of the Beckers, and their adoption of a dispassionate vernacular mode of photography has motivated the kind of work one now finds on display in the Walter Collection galleries. Deadpan and relentless, this photography's systematic repetitions of form impose a welcome order on an otherwise unruly world. Capturing criminals and blast furnaces with equal dispassion, it promises control over whatever is seen, even overseeing itself. But we need to remember that with many vernacular photographs, a repetition of form from picture to picture is a consequence of technical, commercial, or institutional necessity, not of the photographer's desire for taxonomic order or interest in aesthetic innovation. When mugshots are shown next to a suite of work by the Beckers, they are asked primarily to provide evidence that the taxonomic urge is to be found everywhere we look, from high art to vernacular practice, from New York to Bamako, from council or police records to spectacular private collections of photographs. Of course, a trace of their original disciplinary purpose can't help but shadow our perception of these once vernacular photographs of criminals, even in such a setting. But their potential for offering insight into the mechanisms of power and the politics of photography can no longer be confined to the generous gesture on our part of simply including items like these in the history of photography. What matters is how we include them. I've spent my talk this evening tracking back through the inception of the term vernacular photography in order to remind us all of its own original meaning. At least in my work, it was never intended to serve as a new collecting category, even if it has indeed served as a discursive lever to open the history of photography to types of practice previously ignored in it. No, the adoption of the term was always intended to be incendiary, to serve as a call for a transformation of that history in its entirety, in the way it was organized, in the way it was written and displayed, and in the way it accorded and accrued value and meaning. That challenge is still with us. Now that the term vernacular photography is firmly established in the lexicon, I therefore propose that we henceforth abandon it and instead speak only of photography. At least that way, we can entirely focus our critical attention on what photographs do, wherever they are found, rather than on what they are or what they were. For, it seems to me, only by engaging with what photographs are actually doing can we mount an effective argument about what they still might become. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here tonight with you. Thank to Arthur, to Brian, Tina, and Marianne for your invitation. I would like to begin this presentation by with a question. Do you remember when you heard for the first time the word vernacular? I perfectly remember where, when, and how I discovered that word for the first time. I was 20 and I was a student at the National School of Photography in Arles in the south of France. The year had just begun. The inaugural lecture was about the work of Walker Evans. The teacher did not even bother to explain the word vernacular. He did not explain what it means. But he was constantly repeating the word with a very strong southern accent, something like vernacular. I was not the only one to be intrigued by this strange new word. A German student recently arrived in France and who still had some difficulties in understanding French approached me at the end of the course with a puzzled face. He thought that he knew well, very well, the history of German photography, but he had never heard of this German photographer who seemed to have had such a decisive influence on Walker Evans. He asked me, but who is this vernacular? Since then, Werner, my dear Werner, has become one of my heroes. In my personal pantheon, he sits somewhere between Eugène Atget and Walker Evans, and not far from the most productive photographer in the history of photography, Mr. Anonymous. More seriously, what is the vernacular? I really don't want to be like this professor who had spoken to us for more than 1 hour about the vernacular without defining what it means. So this is the reason why I would like to start my presentation by trying to define what is the vernacular. This is probably the worst thing to do in a symposium like this one. I'm almost sure that my dear colleagues and following speakers will take up my proposed definition to correct or contradict it. But anyway, I like the challenge. What does vernacular mean? I'm sorry, but a bit of etymology is necessary here. The word vernacular is built on the Latin root verna, which designate a slave. Let me specify here that I'm much more in a kind of European approach of the notion, and that it probably might be very, very interesting to consider the use of the word here in the United States in its relation to the history of slavery in this country. But in the antique Greece or in the Roman Empire, the slave is legally assimilated to a thing. Aristotle, for example, defines the slave as a living tool. The vernacular, therefore, defines an activity related to servility or at least to service. The vernacular is something that serves, that is used for something. The vernacular is definitely utilitarian. And this is probably what Charles Baudelaire meant when he wrote in 1859 that photography was never as interesting as when it was the humble servant. The true duty of photography, he wrote, is to be the servant of the science and the arts, but the very humble servant. Baudelaire, of course, was much criticized for this. Today, the revaluation of the vernacular is a way of saying that in a way he was right. But let's come back to the etymology of the word. Verna means slave. But in Roman law, vernaculus more specifically describes a slave who was not purchased or traded, but that was born at home. By extension, the vernacular thus covers everything that is made, grown, or raised at home. It corresponds to a domestic or an homemade production. This is the reason why the vernacular is so often associated with a specific space or a specific place. This is the reason why the vernacular is so often local, regional, or national. Finally, in the social hierarchy, the slave occupies the lowest level. On the scale of cultural values, the vernacular designates a minor position. It is always located below what has been recognized as most worthy of interest by arbiters of culture. It develops on the periphery of what counts or weights in establishing taste. Resolutely popular, more linked to the culture of the masses than to that of the elites, it is the alternative to what we call the great art, the fine art, or the high art. So here is my general definition of the word vernacular. For me, the vernacular and vernacular photography is utilitarian, local, and popular. Of course, it is the largest part of the photographic production. It includes photographs made by police officers or by insurance agents, advertising or wedding photography, portraits taken in studios or by automatic cameras, press photography, documentary photograph, amateur photography, etc., etc. I can hear some of you thinking aloud that if the vernacular equals the whole photography, the word is completely useless because it does not help to categorize or to redefine the meaning of photography. In fact, there is essentially one thing that does not belong to the vernacular. It is artistic photography. Alfred Stieglitz is not vernacular, nor is Jeff Wall or Thomas Ruff, for example. The photographer who gets up in the morning and prepares his equipment and goes photographing with the desire to make art is definitely not vernacular. All that is related to what the German art historian Alois Riegel called the Kunstwollen, meaning the will to art, does not belong to the category of the vernacular. Everything that is made with Kunstwollen does not belong to the vernacular. Vernacular photography is non-art photography. In the field of image, vernacular photography occupies a position of otherness. It is the other or the other side of art. Well, now it seems to be very simple. On one side, we have vernacular photography, and on the other side, we have art. but this is obviously much more complicated because art and the vernacular have rather an ambiguous relationship. First of all, and despite being produced without any Kunstwollen or any will of art, some vernacular photographs are really beautiful. As Susan Sontag wrote a few years ago, an unassuming functional snapshot may be as visually interesting, as eloquent, as beautiful as the most acclaimed fine arts photographs. This is also what the German painter Gerhard Richter means when he says, I consider many amateur photographs better than the best Cézanne. Even if the vernacular is clearly non-artistic, it has a kind of aesthetical quality. And as a result, many artists of the 20th century looked at vernacular photography as a source of inspiration. Laszlo Molinoch, for example, has repeatedly claimed in his articles and books that the artist should look at scientific, press, amateur photography, meaning vernacular photography. Diane Arbus wrote that she liked to look in family albums and then try to do as well. Andreas Gursky also said in 2002 in an interview that his style was not so different from that of his father and grandfather, who were themselves professional photographers, meaning vernacular photographer. The only difference is that between their time, both his father and grandfather were industrial professional photographer. And the only difference is that between their time and his time, the status of photography has changed. They were, the father and the grandfather, they were simply applied professional or vernacular photographer. And Gursky, the one we know, is an artist. The fundamental difference is the Kunstwollen, which today allows the photographer to earn a living, and in the case of Gursky, to earn a better one than his father and grandfather. The three examples I took just now are quite different. It would be easier to find some more. In the 20th and 21st century, many artists looked at vernacular photography and draw their inspiration from it. As a result, it is sometimes difficult from a strictly formal point of view and for an uneducated gaze to distinguish between a piece of art and a vernacular photograph. It should also be noted that a photograph does not really become vernacular until it has lost its initial use value. This is because a crime scene from the beginning of the century is no longer used to search for clues to find a murderer, that over time it can become vernacular. Similarly, it would not occur to anyone to flip through his own family album and describe its content as vernacular. It is only the children, the parents, brothers, and sisters of others who appear to us as vernacular, not ours. When I look at my family album, I'm not saying that I'm looking at vernacular photography. Vernacular images do not really become the other side of art until when they leave their original environment, their primary utility, and begin to be taken into consideration by artists or art professionals. It is only when vernacular imagery enters the cultural sphere that it becomes the other of art. It is also here that lies our difficulty in apprehending this category of images. Photography is in fact vernacular only when it holds a mirror to art. Well, that's it. I've tried to define the vernacular, to explain why its relationship to art is so complex. I would like now to close this short presentation by explaining why, from my point of view, the vernacular is so important, especially today. No one has failed to notice that we now live in a globalized world. One of the most noticeable effects of globalization is standardization. We eat the same thing, we live in the same buildings, we dress the same way, we see the same movies, we collect the same photographs in New York, in Paris, or in Beijing. The vernacular is what preserves some differences between us. My very strong French accent, for example, is completely vernacular. And I think it's quite interesting to have a lecture on the vernacular with a vernacular accent. But because it is deeply determined by the utilitarian, the local, and the popular, the vernacular still shows some cultural differences. It prevents us from being absolutely identical. In a way, the vernacular is a protection against standardization. You know that some watches are waterproof. The vernacular is globalization or standardization proof, if I may put it this way. This is the reason why, in my opinion, the vernacular should be researched, preserved, and promoted. And no matter if you have a French, an American, or a German accent, no matter if vernacular is a good friend of you or not. Thank you for your attention.
Good evening. I'd also like to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. My discussion around the category vernacular is confined to bodies of photographs from Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In his essay called On the Borderline, John Akomfrah argues that Africa has been, I quote, burdened by an excess of signs, literally framed by torment and bliss. Too often, this stems from outside forces of, I quote, global decipherment and conferred objecthood. As part of new work emerging from the African continent, some of us have been attempting to reimagine this excess of signs, and like Akomfrah, seek out illegitimate lines, what he calls bastard allegories. While African photography may exceed European intentionality, the literature on photography and visual theory frequently reaches a limit when it comes to Africa. For those of us who live and work there, our location means we have to think from this limit. In many generally held histories of industrialization and technological innovation, the invention and spread of photographic practices and categories are implicated in a world that's often still divided between the old imperial metropoles and colonial peripheries. And this is despite all the work done to problematize the notion of invention. In the temporal corollary to all of this, Africa is continually lodged in a condition of belatedness. In most boiled-down versions, after its invention, photography and the conventions that grew up around its early proliferation, especially in portraiture, then become adapted to local conditions, vernacularized. This implies that anything Africans then do with photography will somehow always be derivative. The historian of Egypt, Lucy Rizova, has critically analyzed such histories of photography in terms of a diffusionist model. where photographic culture is, I quote, still thought of in terms of adoption, adaptation, response. According to this logic, agency, whether as technology or cultural forms of expertise, emanates primarily from the West. Until recently, and I'm having to be rather reductive because of the shortness of time, most work on Africa in the last 20 years has tended to focus on colonial archives, stereotypes arising from disaster and humanitarian photography, and then the positive qualities of African portraiture as against colonial ethnographies, apartheid racial identification and classification, and Afro-pessimistic photojournalism. The dark view of what Tina Kempt has called the pernicious role photography has played in the history of racial formation had to be overcome, as surely as the Atlantic slave trade gave birth to abolition and African colonies to flag independence. Thus, a preoccupation of our recent work has been to try and pinpoint the emergent binaries around the categorization of photographs, as well as the radical oscillations around them that tend to mark much of the writing on photography in Africa. In a project that we called Ambivalent, we took the notion of ambivalence not in the general sense meaning of mixed feelings, but rather as the co-presence of different and even polarized planes of response at the same time. It might even be that one level is conscious and the other unconscious. We were concerned with the persistence of certain unquestioned categories. The latter tend to circulate around race and redemption, issues that are underpinned by the structuring of both genre and temporality. So first, to talk about genre. In response to negative colonial and post-colonial imaging of African people and situations, many scholars and curators have found much that's positive in studio and personal or family collections. The subjectivities believed to inhere in the studio portraits are deployed to transcend histories of objectification, and numerous authors have sought to flesh out and give nuance to these questions. But while these subjectivities have earned a huge amount of attention, the very objectification assumed to be the starting point of the problem of African representation has received far less critical attention. For example, with South Africa, scholars continue to rely on a polarized notion of a repressive surveillance biopolitical shot for the ID photo as a baseline. And going back to the actual Population Registration Act of 1950 in South Africa and its predecessors is illuminating, because the project of objectification in fact emerges as unstable, insecure, and indeed very hard to pin down and substantiate. This 1950 Act turned each racial classification in South Africa into a legal category. According to Ingrid Masondo, I quote, "Although the Act provides definitions for each racial category, which all reference appearance, no verbal or literal descriptions are offered." Now, it's striking that the nationalist government in South Africa refrained from drawing on those 19th century disciplines and archives to provide templates detailing the specific features it wished to fix to each racial category through the Act. And instead, to quote Masondo, the definition of each race in the Act was thus crafted to place emphasis on sight rather than on actual physical attributes, where the determination of a racial category could encompass the viewers looking and their impressions, or even the performance of the one being looked at. Perhaps then the definitions were intended to invoke historical common sense and shadow knowledge, where everything is visible but unsaid, and where verbal imprecision is accompanied by a visual reaction to appearance. Thus, one is colored or Bantu if one appears to be colored or Bantu to the beholder, usually a policeman. This is far more vague and uncertain than is often assumed, and the ID photographs offer little assistance, as the repressive, negative, disempowering state ID photograph, its parameters have been surprisingly under-examined. Another scholar, Gary Minkley, takes us back to the early 1950 debates on identity photographs and notes that the very nature and status of photography and of the portrait photograph to be used on the identity card were profoundly ambivalent for all concerned. Nevertheless, the South African ID photo, with its connotations of repression, surveillance, colonial apartheid, and the European, tends to be set apart. I quote Minkley, "The emphasis in such work, on studio photographs that is on agency and resilience, produced through terms such as self-fashioning, vernacular, and modern. But what exactly does it mean," he asks, "to name the subjective subject wherein affective histories are individually lodged as residing within certain photographs, but not others? Why certain portraits, yet not others? In an ID pass photograph, so long as it praises or is made vernacular in subsequent self-uses, but not through a routinely described bureaucratic administrative lens. This framing, these terms," he concludes, "seemingly dispel this racial subject." So, my point being that the way the term vernacular is being used in these African debates is part of a generic oscillation. And I remain with two reservations. Firstly, isn't vernacular always in relation to something else? Dialects that are not quite the main language, architectures outside formal canons. I sound like I'm echoing someone else. Can't photographs just be photographs? Can the term vernacular escape hierarchical judgment, or is it trapped, like the domestic or the provincial? If one could show how the mainstream or dominant is vernacular, then we might get somewhere. But doesn't vernacular leave those categories intact? Secondly, and this follows on from the previous speaker, one might hesitate to apply a term derived from the Latin term for the house slave to photographic production in a continent that's seen so much slavery and racialized colonial economies. Now, I've spoken about genre, and I want to move quickly to temporality. Viewing older African photographic collections, there is, in fact, an uncanny repetition of a uniform process across Southern Africa. And here I sound like I'm echoing Ariella Azoulay. The aggressive age of imperialism in the late 19th century actually followed in the wake of tremendous internal historical upheavals led by the expansion of different Nguni kingdoms from the 1820s. These included the Zulu kingdom, the Gaza Empire, and the Ndebele state. The Walter Collection has traces of two of these former kingdoms, and a third emerges from the research of Mozambican photographer Rui Asabuji. Regarding photographs of Cechuayo, Hlonipha Mokoena speaks of the Zulu king's voyage to Britain in 1882 for an audience with Queen Victoria. But while she mentions the recent Zulu military victory at Isandlwana, she leaves out a vital piece of information. These photographs were only taken after the formal surrender of his person to the British. In 1896, as part of their determination to prove formal occupation of the interior of Mozambique after the Berlin Agreements of 1884-5, Muzinho de Albuquerque led a large Portuguese military expedition to Gaza. The legendary King Gongonyana was defeated and arrested. Several portraits were immediately taken by a commercial photographer with the expedition, and, like the Cechuayo on the ship that took the deposed king into exile in the Azores. In 1893, after the defeat of the Ndebele army in southern Zimbabwe, I have no doubt that similar photographs would have been taken of Lobengula had he not disappeared into hiding. Instead, his most prominent wife, Lomadlozi, is photographed around this date and marked as next in importance to Lobengula's mother, possibly to stand in for the figurehead. All these photographs reference a confrontation with a feared enemy with no guaranteed outcome. Both the British and the Portuguese had previously suffered severe setbacks. But once the clash is over, the camera is brought to bear just as the sovereign is wrenched out of his normal sphere and set into a huge spatial displacement under the strange rules of imperial exile. The camera is put in place as a filter that regrades the captive visually and temporally as they begin their passage to final destination and isolation. Even as trouble is taken to reference their former status as kings, this is a photographic dethroning, where the sovereign passes through a film or historical membrane into visibility. But it's like the bleep of a radar as he moves from sovereign command of an entire nation to provincial irrelevance elsewhere. There are many other examples, including Xhosa chiefs from the Eastern Cape frontier, who passed through the filter of Gustav Fritzsche's commissioned camera at the Breakwater prison on their way to life imprisonment and ultimate demise on Robben Island in the 1860s. In almost all these cases, barely a single colonial officer or official had the guts to go and photograph Gungunyana, Cetshwayo, or the Xhosa chiefs while they were still in power. Is this photographic portraiture accompanied by vast firepower and industrial artillery, the vernacular of empire? More to the point, except in a few cases where missionaries managed to take pictures, for example, we have a vast unphotographed, the pre-colonial. The royal photograph is in danger of standing in for entire epochs, of bunching up history into a congealment of conquest and sucking out the history of everything else. The camera acts as a guillotine of the autonomous pre-colonial polity, the shutter coming down to remove its head in one swipe and present it for public view. It is what photography does to temporalities here in Africa that is remarkable. And to quote David Ferris in the collection about Walter Benjamin and history, photography provides a local habitation for the political significance of history. In dealing with such historical asymmetry, for me, terms like filtering, crystallization, and accumulation rather come to mind. These give a sense of a density, feeding the weight of a polarity and feeding oscillation. Thank you.